If you want to understand why Bitcoin was born, you must begin not with code cryptography or computers, but with betrayal, quiet, systemic, and deeply psychological. The year was 2008, and the world was watching the global financial system convulse under the weight of its own excesses. Banks that had preached sophistication revealed fragility. Governments that had promised prudence delivered bailouts. And ordinary citizens, who had played no role in designing the machinery of leverage and derivatives, paid the price in lost homes, lost jobs, and lost faith. Out of that wreckage emerged a question as old as money itself, but newly sharpened by crisis. If institutions entrusted with money could fail so catastrophically, was it possible to design money that did not require trust at all? Bitcoin was not an accident of technology. It was a reaction to history. On October 31, 2008, as markets reeled and central banks expanded, balance sheets at a pace never before imagined, a 9-page white paper appeared on a cryptography mailing list. Its author, calling himself Satoshi Nakamoto, proposed something radical in its simplicity: a peer-to-peer electronic cash system that allowed online payments to be sent directly from one party to another without going through a financial institution. No banks, no intermediaries, no central authority. Just mathematics, cryptography, and a distributed network of participants verifying truth collectively. The timing was not coincidental. Bitcoin was conceived in the shadow of collapse, and its DNA carried the imprint of that moment. To grasp the significance of Bitcoin, you must understand what it was rejecting. Modern money is fiat issued by governments, managed by central banks, stabilized by policy credibility. It functions because people believe it will hold value tomorrow. That belief, as 2008 demonstrated, can be shaken. Bitcoin replaced institutional trust with protocol trust. Instead of believing bankers, you verify blocks. Instead of trusting central banks, you trust code. Instead of policy discretion, you accept algorithmic certainty. This was not merely an innovation. It was a philosophical rebellion. At its core, Bitcoin solved a problem that had haunted digital money for decades: the double spending problem. How do you prevent a digital asset from being copied and spent twice without a central authority? Bitcoin's answer was the blockchain, a public append-only ledger maintained by a decentralized network. Transactions were grouped into blocks, validated through cryptographic proof of work, and chained together in a structure that made history increasingly immutable as it grew. To alter the past, one would need to outcompute the network itself, an endeavor so costly it rendered fraud impractical. Security was achieved not by secrecy, but by transparency and incentives. Early Bitcoin was fragile, obscure, and widely misunderstood. In 2009 and 2010, it existed largely as an experiment among cryptographers and libertarians. It had no price, then a negligible one. It had no exchanges, then primitive ones. It was mined on personal computers by enthusiasts who viewed it as a curiosity or a statement rather than an investment. And yet, embedded in its design were constraints that echoed monetary history with uncanny precision: a fixed supply capped at 21 million coins, a predictable issuance schedule, and periodic halvings that reduced new supply over time. Bitcoin was engineered to be scarce, not by decree, but by mathematics. Scarcity is the oldest pillar of money. Gold had it by nature. Bitcoin had it by code. The first crack in Bitcoin's obscurity came as it acquired price. Markets, even nascent ones, have a way of discovering narratives. As Bitcoin traded for pennies, then dollars, then tens of dollars, it attracted not just technologists, but speculators, skeptics, and idealists. Each cycle of attention brought volatility, and each crashed tested belief. In 2011, Bitcoin surged and collapsed. In 2013, it surged again, only to crash once more after the collapse of Mt. Gox, then the largest exchange. Critics declared it dead repeatedly. Yet each time the network survived. Blocks continued to be mined. Transactions continued to settle. Bitcoin did not ask for permission to exist. What distinguished Bitcoin from earlier bubbles was not price stability. It had none but persistence. Unlike companies that could go bankrupt or technologies that could be abandoned, Bitcoin had no headquarters to shut down and no CEO to arrest. It was an organism distributed across the internet, sustained by incentives and belief. Miners were paid to secure the network. Developers improved the software. Users transacted. A circular economy of trustless trust began to form. As Bitcoin matured, so did the arguments around it. Critics saw wasteful energy consumption, volatility, and association with illicit activity. Supporters saw censorship resistance, financial sovereignty, and an escape from inflationary debasement. Both were partially right. Bitcoin was inefficient compared to centralized systems, but inefficiency was the price of decentralization. It was volatile, but volatility was the signature of a nascent asset discovering its role. It was used at times for illicit trade, but so was cash, and often with less traceability. The deeper debate was not about Bitcoin's flaws. It was about what problem money is meant to solve. Is money primarily a medium of exchange optimized for speed and stability, or is it a store of value optimized for scarcity and durability? Bitcoin leaned decisively toward the latter. It was digital gold for an internet-native world, portable, divisible, verifiable, and immune to monetary policy. For a generation raised amid quantitative easing, negative real rates, and ballooning sovereign debt, this promise resonated powerfully. By the mid-2010s, Bitcoin's rise intersected with broader currents: distrust in institutions, the globalization of capital, and the digitization of everything. Capital controls, bank freezes, and currency devaluations in various countries revealed the fragility of access to money. Bitcoin offered an alternative rail, permissionless, borderless, and independent. For the first time in history, an individual could hold a bearer asset that could be transmitted globally in minutes without relying on a bank. This was not merely a new asset, it was a new capability. Yet Bitcoin's ascent also provoked a reaction. Governments scrutinized it. Regulators debated its classification. Central banks dismissed it, then studied it. Financial institutions mocked it, then built products around it. Each wave of attention pulled Bitcoin further into the gravitational field of the system it sought to exist outside of. Futures markets emerged. Custodians appeared. Institutional investors arrived. What began as an outsider experiment was slowly becoming a mirror held up to the existing financial order. And with that mirror came an uncomfortable reflection. If a decentralized network could provide settlement, finality, scarcity, and censorship resistance without intermediaries, what did that imply about the necessity and the vulnerabilities of the systems that dominated global finance? Bitcoin did not need to replace money to matter. It only needed to exist credibly to force the question. Standing at this juncture, it became clear that Bitcoin was less a currency in the traditional sense and more a monetary referendum, a continuous vote on whether trust should be vested in institutions or protocols, whether money should be elastic or fixed, whether sovereignty should belong to states or individuals. And as adoption expanded, price cycles intensified, and narratives multiplied, Bitcoin entered a new phase 1, where it would be tested not just by technologists and early adopters, but by regulators, central banks, investors, and society at large. A phase where the original question that gave birth to Bitcoin, how to build money without trust, would collide with the realities of power governance and scale, forcing the world to confront whether this digital experiment was a speculative detour or the opening chapter of a profound monetary transformation, a confrontation that would only deepen as Bitcoin moved from the margins of finance toward the center of global debate, revealing tensions and consequences that could no longer be ignored as the era of digital money truly began to collide with the realities of power regulation and scale, revealing that the true test of Bitcoin would not be technological, but social. For once, Bitcoin stepped beyond the realm of cypherpunks and early adopters. It entered a world governed not by code alone, but by law, politics, and human fear. And it was here, at the intersection of decentralization and authority, that Bitcoin's meaning evolved from an experiment into a force capable of reshaping how societies think about money itself. As adoption widened, Bitcoin's volatility became impossible to ignore. Price cycles accelerated with a rhythm that felt almost geological. Slow accumulation, sudden eruption, violent collapse, and then a long, grinding consolidation. Each boom drew in new believers, speculators, institutions, and critics. Each crash expelled the weak hands and hardened the convictions of those who remained. This cyclical brutality was not a flaw, it was a discovery process. Markets were attempting to price something that had no historical precedent, a non-sovereign digital bearer asset with absolute scarcity. Volatility was the tax paid for that novelty. With scale came scrutiny. Governments could ignore an obscure digital token. They could not ignore an asset with hundreds of billions of dollars in market value, traded globally, capable of bypassing capital controls and sanctions. Regulators wrestled with definitions. Was Bitcoin a currency, a commodity, a security, or something entirely new? Courts and agencies disagreed. Some nations embraced it cautiously. Others banned it outright. Still others oscillated between fascination and fear. The response itself revealed Bitcoin's disruptive core. It challenged the monopoly states had long held over money issuance and settlement. Central banks watched closely. For decades, they had refined the art of monetary management, targeting inflation, stabilizing cycles, acting as lenders of last resort. Bitcoin represented a parallel system immune to discretionary policy. It could not be printed in a crisis. It could not be devalued to stimulate exports. It offered no backstop in a panic. To central bankers, this rigidity looked dangerous. To Bitcoin's advocates, it looked honest. Out of this tension emerged a new development: central bank digital currencies, attempts to capture the efficiency of digital money without surrendering control. In this way, Bitcoin acted as a catalyst. Even where it was rejected, it forced adaptation. Institutions once dismissive gradually engaged. Hedge funds allocated. Public companies placed Bitcoin on balance sheets. Custodians, futures markets, and ETFs followed. What had begun as a rebellion against the system was being partially absorbed by it. Critics argued this diluted Bitcoin's ethos. Supporters countered that legitimacy required integration. Both were right. Bitcoin's path forward was not purity or capture, but coexistence, operating both inside and outside traditional finance, depending on the use case and the user's intent. And then there was the question of energy. Proof-of-work mining drew criticism for its consumption, framed as wasteful or environmentally destructive. Yet energy debates have always followed new monetary standards. Gold mining reshaped landscapes. Banking systems consumed cities of offices and data centers. Bitcoin's energy use forced a broader conversation about energy itself, about stranded resources, grid balancing, and incentives. In some regions, mining stabilized renewable projects. In others, it exacerbated scarcity. The truth, as always, was complex. Bitcoin did not invent the trade-off between security and cost. It made it visible. Perhaps the most profound shift Bitcoin introduced was psychological. It reframed ownership. To hold Bitcoin directly was to hold money without permission, no account, No intermediary, no counterparty risk. This concept resonated in places where banking systems were fragile or politicized, where inflation eroded savings, where access to dollars was restricted. For these users, Bitcoin was not a speculative asset. It was a lifeline. The same network that traders used for profit was used by others for survival. This duality made Bitcoin difficult to categorize and impossible to dismiss. Over time, a clearer picture emerged. Bitcoin was unlikely to replace everyday transactional currencies. Its design favored security over speed. But as a store of value, a settlement layer, and a hedge against monetary disorder, it carved out a distinct role. It became a reference point, a benchmark against which all forms of money could be compared. How scarce are you? How censorable? How dependent on trust? Bitcoin asked these questions relentlessly, not with rhetoric, but with existence. Looking back, the rise of Bitcoin fits seamlessly into the long arc of monetary history. Money evolves not through consensus, but through crisis. Shells give way to metal, metal to paper, paper to digits. Each transition is resisted, misunderstood, ridiculed, until necessity forces acceptance. Bitcoin emerged, not because technology allowed it, but because trust had fractured. It is a response to a world where institutions grew powerful enough to fail catastrophically, and individuals sought an alternative rooted not in authority, but in verification. Whether Bitcoin ultimately becomes a permanent pillar of the global financial system or remains a parallel hedge is still unfolding. History rarely resolves such questions quickly. What is already clear, however, is that Bitcoin changed the conversation. It reintroduced scarcity into digital money. It challenged the assumption that trust must be centralized. And it reminded the world that money at its core is a social agreement, one that can be rewritten when enough people decide the old terms no longer serve them. If this journey through the rise of Bitcoin shifted how you think about money, trust, or power share, what resonated most with you? And if you want to continue exploring how financial revolutions are born from crisis and conviction, follow the channel and stay with this unfolding story, because the history of money is far from finished, and the next chapter is already being written.